Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, you're up this week.
Yeah.
What have you brought to the table today?
Yeah, I'm bringing a book called The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. And before we get started talking about this book by Anthony Lowenstein, I want to say that we're discussing this amid an ongoing siege and genocide being perpetuated by the Israeli Defense Force, also known as the Israeli Occupation Force, against the Palestinian people in Gaza.
Right.
As of our recording right now, more than 25,000 people have been killed in Gaza and more than 62,000 people have been injured. And that's just confirmed. So there's a whole backdrop of active violence happening as we're talking about this. This book was written and released well before what is currently happening. It was released back in May of 2023.
That's right.
But it gets into so much history about where we are today and explains some of the context, the weaponry, the frame of mind, the perspective of the officials who are taking part in this siege currently. So, yeah, we wanted to start just by saying that and mentioning what is currently happening because it feels so relevant to everything that's happening around the world right now, but also in particular how we're going to talk about this book, I think.
Yep.
So as I said, this book was written by Anthony Lowenstein, a journalist who has also written a book called Disaster Capitalism, and he's written for several large publications around the world. This particular book details how the government of Israel and the private companies that operate in close coordination with that government have made their defense industry a global model that is revered around the world. The major premise of the book is that, quote, Israel has developed a world-class weapons industry with equipment conveniently tested on occupied Palestinians, then marketed as battle-tested. Cashing in on the IDF brand has successfully led to Israeli security companies being some of the most successful in the world. The Palestine Laboratory is a signature Israeli selling point. And then it balloons out from there. It grows out from there in terms of some of the different things that Anthony Lowenstein talks about. There are chapters about digital surveillance tools, the influence that the Israeli government has with social media companies, diplomatic relationships that Israel has established that are both current, but also things that happened in the past with regimes and governments that no longer exist.
Right.
Weapons they sell to whoever will buy them, and a whole lot more. But those were the major themes that I picked up on as I read through the book. There's a ton of information here. There's a lot of history here of how the Israeli government has operated in ways to control and maintain power over the Palestinian people. And we're only going to scratch the surface here. I really encourage people to look into reading the book, into the podcast episode that Anthony Lowenstein did with Kelly Hayes on movement memos. He was also interviewed on Democracy Now! There's all kinds of clips of him talking about this book on YouTube that you can find. There's just a ton here. So given that, where do you want to start? What stood out to you?
That's some really good context for us. I appreciate you and your introduction of this conversation that we're going to engage in. It's going to be a big one, right? Because this was a huge book.
It was.
And an incredible book. But it also was a difficult book. And
Yeah.
of course, given the topic, it's a difficult book. That sort of makes sense. But it also was difficult, I think, because it was an overwhelmingly thorough showcase of the Israeli government's defense relationships throughout the world and the history and present day power of their military industrial complex and the influence that their military industrial complex has had throughout the world in some of the world's most significant atrocities and wars. But also, as the name of the book implies, its impact and influence and control over Palestine.
Yep.
And I think the ways in which that has been overlooked because of said military-industrial complex and those defense relationships that Israel has developed over the years. And so to me, that's what made this book overwhelming. It
Yeah.
was really wild to see example after little example of countries and companies and corporations using and benefiting from these defense technologies and weaponries and strategies, and how a lot of that has been secretive or hidden from us or from world scrutiny. And so much of what Antony does is share interviews from journalists and folks on the ground and their accounts of what's going on, and showcasing information from documents and conversations, and just providing this thorough accounting of how the Israeli government has used Palestine as this proving ground for testing all of this and enriching its military-industrial complex. And then I think the other thing that they've done, obviously, is benefit financially from that and from all of their partners all over the world. The resounding feeling I had in reading this was just a sense of being overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And in some ways, that's a good thing, because in so many ways, this book opened my eyes to a lot of history and a lot of information, a lot of context that I truly knew nothing about or very little about.
Yeah.
And so to me, in context with those conversations that Antony has had in the spaces that you mentioned, and there's lots out there, but it feels so important that this book exists, and the information and the history and the context that this book provides is out there in the world for all of us to have, to witness, to understand, and to hopefully do something about.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you said was how overwhelming it was and how much information he provided, and that made me think about, and actually reading this book, we got the ebook version from Verso Books, who published the book,
Right.
and the references is about a third of the book.
Yes.
And so this is also a well-researched and well-cited and well-sourced book. So I don't know why, but
No, that's important to name,
yeah,
and an important piece
based on
of
what you said,
why this
yeah.
book is the incredible book that it is.
Yeah. So one of the things that stuck out to me as I read through the book was how the weapons and methods of occupation that Israel has produced and the government has produced as a way to suppress and control the Palestinian people are being sold to basically whoever will buy them.
Yes.
The first chapter is called, quote, "Selling Weapons to Anybody Who Wants Them." And it opens with this story about a Jewish family who were living in Chile when the coup happened in 1973. And the father of the family was court-martialed and imprisoned and tortured by the Pinochet regime. Eventually, he was released, or he was told he was being released as long as he and his family left Chile. And his family heard about this and they planned to move to Israel. And before he was released, he was kidnapped from prison and never seen again. Fast forward decades later, and it's revealed that the Israeli government was selling arms to Chile and the Pinochet regime and had trained troops there. And so there was this I think sense of betrayal from the son of this man who had sought refuge in Israel, despite Israel having a hand in what had happened to his father.
Absolutely.
And so that was the opening story of the book, really, but it highlights how this technology, the methods have been exported around the world. And I'll add that, the U.S. was leading the way in many ways here. And so, we're also connected to this and complicit in this.
Yes.
And the U.S. was propping up the Pinochet regime as well. And, in a lot of ways supporting the coup that happened there. But the book also goes into how Israel and the government there sold arms to Burma, Sri Lanka, Rhodesia, which was an apartheid state that is now Zimbabwe, and a lot more. The book mentions that the Uzi machine gun, which we've all seen in movies and stuff, has been made famous in that way, was one of the earliest developments from arms manufacturers in Israel and was sold to 90 countries, including some of the ones that I just listed. They also sought out diplomatic relationships with dictators in Iran, Romania, Indonesia, Haiti, Argentina, Guatemala, South Africa, and a lot more. And part of that diplomatic relationship was usually about weapons and selling weapons. Those weapons were used in the Rwandan genocide
Right.
in the 90s. This is clearly a government that can and will market its own methods and weapons and technology of occupation and use it as leverage to create diplomatic relationships on a global stage with anyone and everyone, even if they're a repressive dictatorship or a fellow apartheid regime.
Yeah, absolutely. This was one of the things, that opening chapter, I feel like I learned so much from it in terms of
Yeah.
the just incredible reach that the Israeli government has had in terms of profiting from selling its military expertise to the world.
Yeah.
And of course, in turn, that means it's profited from its occupation of Palestine and Palestinians and its hatred of Palestinian people, which is horrific, I think, if you center the humanity of it all. But yeah, I honestly had no idea how many countries have purchased Israel's military and defense weapons and systems and technologies, and how many countries have been trained by Israelis military forces or have had some kind of significant attachment to or support from the Israeli government in committing war crimes.
Yep.
I just had no idea. So you named so many of those countries, and the United States is one of them, and there are so many more. And again, when you think about the appendix that you mentioned, this book has the receipts for all of that. One of the quotes that I wanted to pull from, I think it was that very first chapter, Anthony Lowenstein said, quote, "A historical reckoning of Israel's involvement with some of the 20th and 21st century's most depraved regimes is required. It is a history that is rarely discussed in the public sphere, and many of its details remain hidden in Israeli archives. Despite Israel claiming that it was an isolated and often boycotted nation, it has had close, covert relations with many states. However, a checkered understanding of Israeli military influence from the 1950s onwards is possible and reveals an opportunistic and amoral foreign policy." And so I think that speaks a lot to, and I want to talk about this a little bit more, this idea of what the imperative is of this book, like what some of the things we can take away from it. And I think certainly given what is happening now and the genocide that is taking place now, that statement, this reckoning needs to happen. That statement is a powerful one to take away from this book.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to talk about those covert relations that it had with so many repressive regimes. And as you said, regimes that committed war crimes across the world, because it's not something that we think about. And, we also don't think about it as what has the United States done in that way as people who live in the United States. And so, the history with South Africa is one thing. And there's a lot of information about the relationship with South Africa and how leaders of the Israeli government said how closely their values were aligned.
Right.
And this is apartheid South Africa. This isn't Nelson Mandela post-apartheid South Africa, which I think we're also seeing play out now as South Africa is charging Israel with genocide in the international court. And so, yeah, I think it shows a lot about who your friends are, right? To take it into the most colloquial way I could, it says a lot about who your friends are and who your enemies are, and the history here lays it out for the United States and Israel of who have we propped up, who have been our friends of the United States, and Israel's been closely tied in many ways to that, especially when the United States said, "Oh, we're not going to publicly do this, but hey, buddy, Israel, could you please step in and sell arms to this regime that we are publicly condemning, but we actually support?"
Absolutely.
Wild. Yeah. But so that's all like the technology of weapons and war. I want to talk about Pegasus, which is a different weapon.
Yes.
It's a surveillance tool or weapon that is deployed on individual cell phones. It gained some notoriety in the last 6 or 7 years and popped up in the news more and more, but has been used to surveil journalists, including Javier Valdez Cardenas, a Mexican journalist who reported on drug cartels and corruption in Mexico, and he was killed. He had been surveilled by officials in the Mexican government who were using Pegasus and had bought it from NSO Group, which is a quote-unquote private company in Israel who sells this. And then there's Jamal Khashoggi, who was a journalist and critic of Saudi Arabia, who was dismembered after being surveilled by Saudi officials who likely used Pegasus to track his activity. This is a high-powered surveillance tool that sits in mobile phones and can see everything on the phone. So, encrypted messaging, it doesn't matter because it's in your phone.
Yep.
So that end-to-end encryption doesn't matter when the end is being monitored. It's used by Israeli officials to surveil Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and occasionally their own citizens, like during the COVID-19 lockdowns where they use lockdown rules to target pro-Palestinian activists and send them text messages that said, you've been in close contact with somebody who has tested positive for COVID and now you have to quarantine. And it was used as a way to stop people from meeting with one another.
Absolutely.
But this is also used as a diplomatic relations tool. NSO Group, which I mentioned, is the company that owns Pegasus and sells it, claims that there are no ties between it and the Israeli government. This is a common line about all of the companies that support the Israeli military-industrial complex. But there are multiple instances mentioned in the book where Israeli officials will meet with another government, and then shortly after, that government will purchase Pegasus from NSO Group. So Anthony Lowenstein actually calls that line of there not being a relationship a lie directly because of this evidence. So, for example, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Israel in July 2017, and India started using Pegasus immediately in July 2017. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu visited Azerbaijan in December 2016, and then they had access to Pegasus in 2018. Israel stated in documents, officials in the government stated that they hoped that Saudi Arabia's use of Pegasus would, quote, create tension with their mutual enemy, Iran. This is essentially unregulated, ungoverned surveillance that lawmakers across the globe can't keep up with to regulate it at the rate that it is developed. And it's such a powerful tool, and it's being used in malicious ways because of how powerful it is.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe it. It's a really powerful tool that's being used in such atrocious ways. And the ways it's being used on regular people, it's being used on journalists, it's being used on countries. It was used during COVID, in a time when we're all scared to death of this thing, and being used to thwart activism, any sort of work being done to challenge a government and call out a government. Yeah, every bit of this book about technology and thinking about technology's role in the military-industrial complex was fascinating to me. And you mentioned India. I mean, there were so many examples of the Israeli government's role and how it was complicit with so many other countries gaining access to this technology and using it in these nefarious ways as well, which was wild.
And he described it as a carrot. It's a carrot that the Israeli government has in terms of establishing diplomatic relationships with other countries.
Yeah, and they sure have.
Yeah,
that's a really huge part of this book. And again, I learned so much from it. One of the other things I wanted to mention was, and you said this at the top, there's no way we can talk about everything in this book at all. So I'm jumping all the way to the conclusion of this book. Some of the takeaways from it, Anthony Lowenstein, I think, wrote a phenomenal conclusion for this book because in so many ways it summarized all of the content in this book really well, I thought, and it provided a powerful analysis and, as I mentioned earlier, this imperative for action that I thought was so important to take away from this. So there are a couple of quotes that I pulled out, and I'm just going to read them here. First, he says, quote, "Nonetheless, Israel's position as a global leader in surveillance, drones, and ethno-nationalist fervor will not dim anytime soon. There is currently no political or financial price being paid by Israelis for mainstreaming this system. If anything, Russia's actions in Ukraine will fuel the global arms race, especially in Europe, to invest even more money in the most lethal offensive and defensive weapons, from drones to missiles and surveillance tech to phone hacking tools. Israel is a direct beneficiary of this surging investment." And so just a few pages later, he says, quote, "What this means in practice is higher walls and tighter borders, greater surveillance of refugees, facial recognition, drones, smart fences, and biometric databases. By 2025, the border surveillance industrial complex is estimated to be worth $68 billion US. And Israeli companies like Elbit are guaranteed to be among the main beneficiaries. And then just one more quote later on in that same chapter. And I think this is a huge takeaway. And again, this imperative that I think we all need to be concerned about. He says, quote, "What Israel hopes will continue to extend its appeal beyond nations that just want some of the most intrusive and lethal military equipment on the planet is the growth of states that share its commitment to ethno-nationalism." So I think it's not difficult to see how one can lead to the other, and how concerning and scary it is given the price that Palestine and Palestinian people have had to pay for this. And beyond that, the global violation of human rights that has taken place and has occurred all over the world as a result of the Israeli government's efforts, their military, their colonization efforts, just everything that Antony highlights in this book. And yeah, it's wild.
Yeah. And one of the things we didn't even talk about, but I think I mentioned as I introduced this book last week, is the border surveillance stuff.
Yeah.
And how much effort and attention is being paid to that because of the walls and the technology that Israeli companies have developed to keep Palestinian people in their place in their minds. And that then being exported to the Mexico border that the United States has.
Yeah, what's happening here?
Or the drones being exported to the European borders in the seas as people are seeking refuge in Europe from places that Europe has created the conditions in which people need to leave from.
Right.
So yeah, all of that is also a huge part of this that we didn't get to talk about because it's time to talk about application.
All right. Yes.
So how does this book and our conversation here apply to our day-to-day lives? My application is a reflection on, is to reflect on empire and imperialism. So much of what we talked about here has either been explicitly or implicitly rubber stamped by our government here in the United States through funds and military aid provided directly to the Israeli government. We are living in the belly of the empire, and the effects of this empire worldwide are countless. So what's our role in that as individuals? What does it mean to support or participate in this empire? What does resistance to the violence that we export across the world look like? People are dying because of the decisions our elected officials are making to support or prop up violent regimes around the world, either covertly or overtly. And we're sending money regularly to Israel to support their occupation of Palestine and currently the siege and the genocide that they're perpetuating against people in Gaza. And so I think we have to reckon with what that means, both individually and collectively.
Absolutely. I love when our applications are in sync. And you said it so brilliantly. I think the application from this book is just how important it is to know and to understand that when power goes unchecked, it can only lead to disaster. It can only lead to what we are witnessing right now.
Yeah.
And so the way in which Israel has used its oppression of Palestine and the Palestinian people to grow not only its defense and military power, but also its standing in the world is one thing. The way that other countries have in lots of different ways supported that effort and looked the other way, the way that the Palestinian people have been treated, disregarded, occupied, displaced, murdered, all of that to me shows us what it means for power and leadership to go unchecked. And so I think the application is not just that, but also that if it can happen there, it can happen anywhere. And we have seen that. We have talked about that on this podcast. This book to me is a call to us that we all have to unite and fight against that at all costs in order to protect all of us and our shared humanity. And so I think you're absolutely right. It's an individual thing, but it's also a collective thing that we have to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. All right, let's talk about homework.
Okay.
What are we going to do to continue learning beyond our conversation today? I'd like to check out some of the other books that he mentioned throughout this book, like An Army Like No Other, How Israel Defense Forces Made a Nation by Chaim Breshith Zabner, and Fateful Triangle, the United States, Israel, and the Palestinians by Noam Chomsky, and Power, Politics, and Culture, interviews with Edward Said, who's a Palestinian academic and activist. I also want to throw in Light in Gaza, which is a book that was released recently that is about imagining the future of Gaza beyond the cruelties of occupation and apartheid. Light in Gaza is a powerful contribution to understanding Palestinian experience. I think that these books will give me more understanding both of Israeli imperialism and the occupation of Palestine and the Palestinian territories, and the imperialism of the United States and the ways that we've been more than complicit in all of this as well.
Yeah, that's really good homework. And I want to join you in that because I want to continue my learning about this. And what I was thinking about is that I just want to give this book another read, to be honest. Like I said at the jump, that I was overwhelmed at times reading this book in terms of the content, in terms of the history presented, the military and state power on display, the crimes against humanity, that all of that at times I struggled to get through it, right? I struggled to read it and to get through it. It just was overwhelming. And so I want to go back through the book again to see what I may have missed reading it the first time, and to see sort of what additional learning and connections I can make to what we talk about here in the podcast in terms of collective liberation. There were times where I just was trying to take in the numbers and the atrocity and the players, and that was enough in some moments. And some nights sitting on my couch reading this book, that was enough.
Yep.
But I don't want to sell myself short on the learning, especially with something so important like this. So I just want to give this book another read, and let's add more books to our list to learn more about this. Absolutely.
Yeah, that never-ending to-read list.
We'll get there.
We will.
Get there.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it for this book today. And Damien, you're up next time. So what are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yes. So for next week, I'm going to bring a piece from Inquest called No More Family Policing, written by Eleanor J. Bader, and it was published back in December, so it's still pretty new. And, I know we've discussed pieces from Inquest before on the pod, but just to share again, Inquest is an online publication and forum that is working to share really incredible and bold ideas that can be used to end mass incarceration here in the United States. So they've got so much incredible content on their website. You can find it at inquest.org. And so I'm excited to bring another piece from them to the table. I will be honest, I have not read much of the piece at all yet. I skimmed some lines just to be able to maybe intelligently talk about this for the context of introducing it.
Yeah.
But the sense I get is that it's an exploration of what family policing means and looks like in the context of our criminal punishment system, our educational system, our social services system in this country, what that has meant for real people and families, like the impact that has had on real people and families. And just a call for thinking about how abolitionist organizing has to include and focus on family policing in all of its work.
Yeah.
So I'm looking forward to actually reading this piece and getting to talk about it with you next week.
Me too. That sounds great. And an area of abolition we haven't really dived into yet.
Yeah.
So another place to continue learning about all of the tentacles of the prison industrial complex.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's next week. But with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out on YouTube and sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. We'll talk to you next week.